There are two sources for knowledge of how God acts in human history. They're faith and reason. By faith, we mean revelation, which is the story of God, how he explained his plan to the Hebrew people. And by reason, we mean philosophy, or the history of Logos, which is how the Greek people figured out that plan on their own. For our purposes, that story began 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. At that moment in time, Abraham left Ur of the Chaldees and settled in what is now Palestine or Israel, depending on your politics or your theology. Abraham's grandson Jacob had 12 sons, but the one he loved the most was Joseph. And because of that fact, all of his older brothers hated him and plotted to kill him, and would have killed him if his brother Reuben hadn't intervened and persuaded them to sell Joseph into slavery instead. Was God in charge of human history at that point? He sure was. Because we knew that Joseph would end up, because God knew, we didn't, that Joseph would end up in charge of the granaries of Egypt at a time when famine stalked the land of Israel, and that the brothers who wanted to kill him would end up coming to him and asking him for help. God allowed this to happen so that Joseph could say, the evil that you intended to do to me has been turned by God into good. And he wanted Joseph to say that because it contains the meaning of human history. God allows evil to bring about good. He has to allow evil, because the only way he could ban evil is by banning free will. And the only way you can ban free will is by banning rationality. Because you, as a human being, choose the good. Animals don't. They have mechanisms that choose it for them. And so the only way you can get rid of evil is to get rid of human beings. And he's not going to do that. For 300 years, the Hebrews flourished in Egypt. But then a Pharaoh came to the throne who knew not Joseph, and trouble began, until things got so bad that Moses had to lead God's people out of Egypt back to Israel. Once again, the Hebrew people could say to their enemies, the evil that you intended to do to me has been turned by God's power into good. The Exodus took place at around 1300 BC. At around the same time, the world was coming to an end north of Egypt in the Aegean, in the area now known as Greece or Turkey. There was a high civilization there at the time known as the Minoan civilization, and we know that because we discovered their palaces in Crete containing their written languages known as Linear A and Linear B. That civilization disappeared forever around the time of Moses. And the symbol of that destruction is the story of the fall of Troy, which Homer immortalized in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer's epics did not get written down until the 8th century BC, largely because the collapse of civilization, which occurred at the time of the fall of Troy, was so great that no one knew how to write anymore. Homer was the beginning of a movement of history toward Logos, toward an understanding of Logos. If by history we mean some written account, it took 400 years before Homer got into writing, before they wrote down that epic. Every man who lived after the fall, no matter how primitive, knew there was a God, that God was in some sense a masculine figure, and that he lived in the sky. At this point, human imagination took over, and the God who was the great man was given a beard and a wife, and the best account we now have that is called mythology, and Homer is the best example of that. By the time this got written down, there were people who understood that this is an inadequate description of God. If there can't be gods, and if they're gods, they can't be fighting with each other over some chick by the name of Helen. And all of this drama, this kind of soap opera drama, this cannot be God. And there were Greeks who were smart enough to understand that. And they were called physiologoi, or what we would call physicists. And the first man of this group who started writing around the same time that Homer came into writing was Thales of Miletus. And he said that there has to be some unifying principle here. And he looked around, living on the Aegean, he said, it must be water. So everything is water. Okay, well, that got the ball rolling. It's not adequate. And then Anaximenes came along and he said, no, everything is air because you're surrounded by air. I know you need water to live, but you're surrounded by air, and air goes in and out of you. And it's the word for spirit is also the word for soul. And when you die, you breathe your last. And so it's air, but it wasn't air. And then we had another physicist by the name of Heraclitus, who lived in Ephesus and was a Greek-speaking citizen of the Persian Empire, and he said it's fire. And he said it's fire because if you look at a flame, it's always changing and it's always the same. And that's what life is like. It's always changing, it's always the same. And we have the most famous word, the famous image that we have from Heraclitus is you can't step into the same river twice. These two traditions came together when St. John wrote his gospel, and he wrote it in Greek. The two traditions I'm talking about, the Hebrew tradition, where God speaks to you directly, as he spoke to Moses, but when he spoke to Moses, he spoke in a kind of metaphysical way that I'm sure Moses didn't understand. As a matter of fact, I don't think anybody understood it for 2,000 years, because when Moses said, well, tell me who you are so I can tell these people, he said, I am who am. Well, he could have said, I am self-subsistent being. But nobody would have understood that, because nobody understood I am who am either. And so it took a long time for Logos to develop before people understood in a sophisticated way what ultimate reality was, because it's no physical thing. It can't be a physical thing. That's where the physiologi, they tried, but it's not going to be a physical thing. It's not going to be physical in any way that we know, and the closest word we have to that understanding of transcendent reality is Logos. St. Paul had been expelled from the synagogues. He could no longer speak to the Jews, and he had a dream about this Greek beckoning to him from across the Aegean. And he went across the Aegean, and he went to Athens, and he went to the top group of philosophers in Athens, a group called the Areopagus. And he gave the wrong speech. I'm sorry. But he gave the Ephesus speech in Athens. That was not the Areopagus. They were philosophers. They understood things like the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover. They understood that Plato said that God was the demiurgos, the worker for the people, and they understood that nobody could bring that together. They were incoherent. It was impossible. How can you be transcendent in eternity and care for you? Well, it's impossible. And that was the impasse of Greek philosophy until St. John, I think, cognizant of Paul's failure at the Areopagus, wrote his prologue, his metaphysical prologue to the gospel, in which he said, "En arche en ha logos." In the beginning there was logos. There was never a time when there wasn't logos. There was never chaos. As long as there is being, there is logos. Okay? Kai logos en prostheon, and logos is with God. Oh, I don't know what that means. I don't know, what does that mean? And then the third one, which is easier to understand, kai logos en theos. And logos is God. Now that's a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss, and it took the church 300 years of discussion before they could bring two words together, namely the word son, as in Father, Son, and logos. How do these two words relate? And it turns out that they relate. The word that connects them is called the Trinity. And that took a long time, and it took a lot of struggle. And the struggle invariably involved the enemies of Logos, namely the Jews, who sided with the Arians, who were determined, who had this investment in God just being one, and did not want to see this sophistication develop, and so they did everything within their power to thwart it. And in a sense, it's a miracle that they didn't succeed, because this is not easy. This is not simple. Because, I mean, let's give Arius credit for what he said. Look, he said the Father precedes the Son. Can you have a son without a father? Well, that must mean that there was a time when the Son was not. And if there were ever a time when the Son was not, he's a creature. And if he's a creature, he's not God. And so there's no Trinity. Well, that's hard. It takes a very sophisticated mind to go beyond that. And that's exactly what the church had to do. And the problem here is, at this point, this is like the train of history. This is Logos in human history. And either you get on the train or the train leaves the station without you. And the main group that got left standing on the platform were the Muslims. Islam got its idea of Jesus Christ from the Nestorians, who didn't believe that Jesus Christ was God. Now, the fact is that science did develop in the Western world because of the incarnation, because of Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ was the Logos incarnate. And if the Logos is incarnate, that means what we would call matter or nature or whatever it is has a plan to it. And basically you can rely on God, and you can rely on that plan because you can stay up night after night and you can watch those stars and watch them go around, and there's a plan to it, and you can figure the plan out. This is not like the God of Islam. Maimonides said the God of Islam is like the caliph. God of Islam is an exalted caliph. And he doesn't know when he takes an evening ride in his carriage, and when he gets to the gate of the palace grounds, he doesn't know whether he's going to go left or right. Well, how can you figure out what that God's going to do? What is that God's plan? There is no plan. There's no Logos. There is will. And so Allah is a Nietzschean. And your job is basically to submit to his will no matter what. And your mind can access the Logos of God even in nature if you persist. And this is what made the West what it is today. Has God abandoned his people? Did he abandon them then? Did he abandon them at the crucial moment when the difference between history going forward comes down to one letter in a Greek word? The difference between homoousion and homoiousion? No. No. He didn't abandon them then. He didn't abandon them at any time in human history, because God is Logos, and Logos is always there. God is like the moon. Its shape never changes, but sometimes we can't see it. And sometimes only a sliver of it is apparent to our eyes. So Hegel, the man I started off talking about, the famous German philosopher who started off as a Lutheran theology student at the time of the French Revolution, called the action of God in human history the cunning of reason. Die List der Vernunft. And by that he pretty much meant what Joseph meant when he said that God was constantly taking evil and turning it into good. That is God's action in human history. That is what human history is about. There has never been a time when that hasn't been happening, even if you couldn't see it. It was happening.